Right, well, thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed lunch. Good to see everyone still here. Obviously, we're all not, what was it, distressed pessimists or something? There is hope. Right, we're going to go straight on with our next speaker, Dan. So Dan's been in the supply and procurement industry for many, many years. He's a lead consultant with, what I understand is the leading consultancy in this sort of area, so buying and selling. When we did some research, these guys came out really top, and one of the things is they already had a lot of available resources on their website. They had a "Are you ready for Brexit?" questionnaire that you could do, lots of bits and pieces, and they again came and like all our speakers have given their time free of charge. So if you do feel that you've got something to learn, then he is obviously here to advise you commercially afterwards as well. But first of all, let's pick his brains for free and hand over to Dan at Efficio. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Just check, that's working. Yep, good. Yeah, so thanks for the introduction, but yeah, just quickly a couple of words around who Efficio are and what we do, just to sort of set the perspective that we're going to come at this from. So we're the largest procurement specialist consultancy in the world. So we're around 500 people, focused entirely on the procurement supply chain space. We work with all sorts of different clients. Typically a bit larger than most of the organisations in this room, but we work with sort of medium-sized businesses all the way up to some of the biggest banks in the world, and also government, and we help them essentially get more value from their supply chains and from their suppliers, whether that be through optimising the way they're doing logistics or doing deals with their suppliers. When it comes to Brexit, so we have done a reasonable amount of work both with government and the private sector. So I've personally led a few programs where we've used some of the methodologies and some of the approaches that I'm going to talk about here. So we've led some work with DEFRA, with HMRC, we're working with the MOD at the moment from the government side, and much wider, larger number of private sector organisations. So hopefully some of that will be interesting. I expect for some of you, some of the things I'll talk about are probably maybe coming from the perspective of slightly larger businesses, but they're always, these are what we see as best practice, and obviously then it's part of your job to translate that into what can you put in place and what can you actually do when you're in a smaller scale. So, there's me. Yes, and very briefly myself, I've been in procurement and supply chain for my whole career, which is around about 10 years now. Mixture of all sorts of different industries, public sector, private sector, everything from financial services to education through to manufacturing. My first role before I moved into the dark side of consultancy was in healthcare, looking at the manufacture and distribution of medical machinery, which is an interesting world. You're trying to ship stuff that's radioactive to Iran, which we did do successfully sometimes. So, so what we're going to talk a bit about here is a combination of some of the very practical things we need to do in terms of keeping goods moving, but also some of the bigger picture things, and what's the role of procurement in more of an age of uncertainty, of which Brexit is obviously a big part. So things we'll cover. I'll probably spend maybe a third of the time talking about some of the background and some of the challenges, and 2/3 talking about what can we do about it and what can we practically do. But we'll talk a little bit about process. We've touched on some of these things with some of the other speakers so far, so I won't dwell on them too long. But we will talk about what's the so what of some of these changes and some of these challenges from a procurement perspective. Particularly talking what we call a category perspective, which I'll tell you in a second. And so we'll then move on to what can we do about it with hopefully some reasonably practical frameworks that you guys can go and apply in your own businesses. So simplifying Brexit down, because it's complicated and lots of things whizzing around. But from a procurement perspective, looking at how you engage with suppliers, it's changes to these things. It's changes to potentially to prices in markets. Changes to prices might become more volatile. We've already seen foreign exchange movements. It's changes to tariffs, and it's regulatory changes, not necessarily barriers. Some of these might be barriers coming down to certain markets. So it's changes to the ease of moving people and goods around the world. These are the challenges that we face all the time, right? We've seen prices change in different markets. We've seen foreign exchange move before. And we've seen tariffs and things move as well in the past, right? Lots of you will export all around the world, not just to Europe. So these are challenges that we see all the time. But probably the difference with Brexit is that all of those are happening at the same time. And they're happening across what is the UK's largest trading partner. So procurement as a capability, procurement as a function, and we typically go and work with organisations that have a team of people called procurement, whereas you guys will have you going and doing procurement. But procurement will typically has the tools and techniques, but does have the capability and especially the capacity to react to all these challenges. We've used this to try and simplify scenario planning, and this actually it's very, very simple. We've kind of touched on some of this earlier, so I won't go in lots of detail. But the way we've approached scenario planning is to say, well, we can see everything here as kind of a walk back from the no deal scenario, right? So no deal will be the biggest change. So if you can model the impact under no deal of those various things, and okay, you have to take some scenarios. You're never going to know exactly, but if you can model them under no deal, you can then walk back and model them under those different scenarios. Current plan has been sitting there for 12 months now, and it's meant 4 different things or 9 different things as I've presented it, done this presentation to different people. But and actually, the current plan that we've got since a couple of weeks ago is actually closer to that no deal side than the current plan when I did this presentation in January, for instance. But it's changed. So, but that can you can help work things through by just going, right, what would it look like if we had no deal? Walk back, walk back, walk back. It's you should hopefully then not waste too much effort planning for things that won't happen. Another point, and this actually came up very strongly in the conversation we were having in the corner around the opportunities and risks. Brexit is a process, not an event, and it's not the only thing that's going on in the world and that's having an impact on procurement, on tariffs, on trade. We've got a chap in the White House who's got some ideas, which are having some fairly similar impacts. So we're seeing uncertainty. So I just want to talk a couple of examples. So we talked about foreign exchange, and we've also talked about barriers to movement of people. These 2 charts at the top, you can't see all of the things, but what they're showing is that we've already seen change. So talking about Brexit as something that we need to get ready for in 10 days' time is incorrect. Yeah, virtually everyone in the group I was in the corner, was already seeing impacts and was already having to make decisions. And so we've seen that's the sterling versus the US dollar, sterling versus a basket of currencies versus anything. Sterling has dropped since the referendum and is much more volatile than it has been in the past. So that's what that graph on the left-hand side is showing. On the right-hand side, the important thing is the blue line. Right, that little wiggly blue line is migration to the UK from the EU, and it drops off a cliff around the date of the Brexit referendum. So what that's and okay, we've got still slightly increasing immigration from outside the EU, but that's telling us that we're getting potentially different skill sets, that we're getting people with different language capabilities. We've got a changing labour force. Is the so what of that? So things are changing. We've got real impacts happening now, and that's going to carry on, regardless of which of those different scenarios that we end up with. That's going to carry on because we're going to have that uncertainty is going to endure. So timelines. I'm not going to. Mark's talked you through. He's far more of an expert than I am in political scenario planning earlier today. From my perspective, so the so what is. We're going to keep seeing uncertainty, and that's going to be over the next decade. right, as we go through potentially a transition period, followed by defining and understanding and then reacting to what all our new trading relationships might be around the world. So there's all sorts of nuance within that, and that's a bit of a simplification, but it's a process, not an event. It's about uncertainty. It's happening now. But we can break it down to those things of tariffs, movement, prices. So particularly, one of the first things people always talk about in terms of Brexit and where their heads immediately go is, right, stuff getting stuck at Dover, right? It's, what can I do? So, so there will be, if we go with the current deal that Mr. Johnson has on the table, there will be certain changes. Now, we don't know exactly what those will be until we've gone through a period of through the negotiation of the future relationship. But we do expect there to be changes. And actually, if we were stayed in complete alignment, you'd probably be thinking, what was the point of all of this faff over in the future? So some of the headlines are, and what we've got up here, I'll come on to some of the things that we can practically do about them later. We touched on most of them already, but there are some really practical things. Right? We're going to be doing, someone's going to need to do customs declarations. Yeah, that can be laborious. In my first job, there were people sitting there whose job was to manage the process of getting stuff in and out of the country, and that was because when we were shipping, in this case, radiotherapy machines to different parts of the world. But that will become daily life for people that, for organisations that export to Europe. Obviously, tariffs we've spoken about, and we've also touched on VAT. These are complicated, bureaucratic things that we're going to have to get used to. And actually, probably one of the things to do is to think about where and how you can afford professional help to bring some of these, to address some of these things. So yeah, lots of small changes, probably unknown as to exactly what it's going to look like, but opportunities as well. And something we'll touch on in terms of one of the messages we come through around being ready to react is that for every risk that there is to each of you as organisations, if you're seeing a risk, well, that's also an opportunity. If you make a mistake, that's an opportunity for your competitor, and vice versa. So these are changing times. An angle that sometimes, that we often, when we talk to our clients, find that they miss is what we call the category angle. Now, in the procurement world, what we mean by a category is it's a market that you're buying from. So we'll talk about a category in terms of facilities management or raw materials or something like that. So, but it's that macro picture. So, and we often find people miss that because they look, everyone immediately goes to, can I get that piece of kit in? What's that individual supplier doing? And that's really important. But actually to say, what's going on in a wider market sense? Where am I going to sit in a market that is changing? And what does that mean for me and my business? Sometimes gets a bit lost. It doesn't have to be a hugely detailed analysis. It can be a bit of thinking. So what does this mean? This says, and this, again, maybe for a larger organisation, this is how it would look, but for lots of you, this is exactly how things will look. So you're engaging a supply market. You've got a bunch of different contracts. Each one of those contracts, you've got a bunch of different terms in it that you've done. Maybe you've looked at some of them recently. Maybe you haven't looked at some of them recently. Maybe you've done them quickly because you needed to get something in. But you're engaging a set of suppliers through a bunch of different contracts. The thing is, that's a part of a wider supply market. Quite often, these suppliers, if we take something as simple as cleaning, right, they're pulling on exactly the same labour force, right? And there are, so those pressures that are going to be felt within that wider market are going to come back and hit you. So regardless of whether your contract A there is, you think it's watertight, you think you've definitely got supply, if your suppliers down here are facing big cost pressures and actually that contract becomes unviable, they're going to find a way out of it. We all know, we know that, whether that be through dropping service levels, whether that be through just seeking to renegotiate. So sometimes that bit can be missed. If we do take a particular example, this is the typical sort of cost breakdown of the facilities management market. So we're getting a bit nitty-gritty and a bit detailed here. But if we look, so this is people going around fixing buildings, doing cleaning, fixing air conditioning units. So maybe not for some of you guys, but definitely for the retailers that you're selling into. Some of you are retailers. This is a market that's really important. Your cleaning costs are an important part of your cost breakdown. So within this sector, typically at well over half, and that's even a bit low, well over half of the costs in the facilities management sector are labour costs, and within that, roughly a quarter of people working in that sector in the UK are EU nationals. So we can all do the maths on that. There's a significant chunk. When you combine that with the fact that in this sector margins are typically less than 5%, right? It doesn't take much for contracts to stop being profitable for suppliers, or for them to become much more profitable if things move in a different direction. But it's a good example of saying, right, you only have to get a 10%, 5-10% wage increase for your facility supplier to not be able to service a contract, and then that's going to get passed on to you. If that happens in this category, it's going to happen in a bunch of others, and that snowball effect can quite quickly have big impacts on the organisation. Again, it was something that came up with the group of people in the corner that we spoke around, was margin maintenance and cash flow management. These are business challenges that are just probably being brought into a slightly more, starker relief by Brexit as a challenge. Okay. So, summing up on the challenge, so from a procurement perspective, we can simplify Brexit, but lots of things happening at the same time can mean we can be overloaded. Where do I start? What do I actually do something about versus what do I hope it goes away? That's particularly challenging with the process and timings being uncertain. But if we see Brexit actually as a symptom of a slightly changing market, and we say, right, how am I going to react as a business to flourish in slightly more uncertain times, then actually we can move on to some quite practical things that you can do to address that. So it's about being ready to react is the slogan we've used around it. And that's based on good business practice. So hopefully what we're going to go through now, there's some useful things which are useful to you regardless of the Brexit context, but just as a business as a whole. How am I doing? Right, so I'm going to talk through 4 things, and they kind of get more strategic and bigger in terms of the level of change, the more to the right we go. So the first bit is probably what everyone thinks when everyone's expecting me to talk about. Right? How do we make sure that we don't get stuff stuck in a warehouse in Calais because we've fallen out with the French?
Last 500 years.
Which might happen anyway, regardless of Brexit. Then secondly, how do we then build the base of knowledge and capability that we can start reacting to whatever's thrown at us? And we can talk through, that's the particular methodology that we've used with DEFRA, with HMRC, with all sorts of different organisations. Then we get into some more of the strategic stuff, and this is where I think the procurement function needs to change. What's particularly relevant for you, hopefully for lots of the businesses here, will be around the sort of what does the procurement capability of the future need to look like to be able to react more nimbly, faster to challenges. So, firstly, this is the nitty-gritty bit, right? So, far from an exhaustive list, these are some of the things that I'll look to bring out. There are great checklists online that are far more detailed than I necessarily go to. But the British Chamber of Commerce is a great place to start for just reams and reams of stuff to check. There's no point in me rewriting that. They've already done it. But these are the things that these are some of the things that I draw out as real things to check on. So, firstly, origins of goods. So, do you have visibility down your supply chain? Do you know where different bits of your goods come from? Especially important if you're transshipping goods or moving them into the country and out the country, to be able to understand what's that certificate of origin, where does things come from, because that will drive potential tariff implications. Oscar spoke earlier a little bit around you can model tariff implications. We've done that for organisations, and we've modelled tariff implications, we've modelled labour cost implications. We've said for one organisation there's a possibility their cost base could go up by 5 to 10%. And no, it's not likely, but it's a realistic possibility, and therefore we need to consider what you do in that case. VAT treatment is important to get into. I'm not a tax expert, but it is it's potentially very laborious and complicated. Real practicalities: who's going to do your customs declarations? You're going to do them yourself? Are you going to pay someone else to do it? And these obviously are assuming customs declarations happen and they come in, but if they do, these are things you're going to need to think about. Because if you're doing them yourselves, you need different levels of capability and capacity if you outsource that. But then if you're going into then you're buying from a supply market that's potentially suddenly very busy. So where are you going to be within that queue? There's a people angle to this. In terms of, and this is actually for us, for Efficio as a business, is probably the single biggest impact we might have is, of our 500 people, 400 of them are not UK nationals. There's probably half of them are EU nationals. So we have to make sure that they've got the right to stay here, that they've got the right to work, and also that we can, also that our British people can go and work abroad. And probably another one where I'm not a deep expert, but data and personal data is something to understand. So you've all gone through the GDPR challenge. Right? We don't know necessarily in the future what agreement there'll be between the UK and the European Union in terms of whether the UK can hold data, can hold personal data. So understanding where all that sits, and lots of you will have customers' names, addresses, bank details, all sorts of things sitting on your systems or sitting in your possession, and you're responsible for them. Understanding where those sit is very important. So a few things that you can do. Some of these we've touched on, but there's the option of looking at becoming an approved economic operator. Now, what does that mean? Means essentially you're accredited as a business to manage import and export, and rather than the burden of proof for each of your declarations being placed on each individual transaction, you're audited as a business and trusted to manage that process. That means you get access to priority clearance, can reduce your administration, and can make things faster. And there are various other more arcane customs procedures you can get access to through it. The other side of that is you've got to do the work to get it, and you've got to do the work to maintain it. So that would be an investment case, a decision for each business to make. You can go further in terms of using bonded stores. And what bonded stores are essentially a mechanism by which, especially when you're bringing goods into the UK, if you put them into bonded stores until they come out again, you don't have to pay duty on them. So especially if you're transshipping goods are coming into the UK and then going out again, bonded stores can mean that you don't have to pay that duty and then reclaim it back. So they can be useful. But again, costly to maintain, you have to pay to get them. Even if you engage a supplier to do it for you, you still have to pay for that service. But useful. What I would encourage you to do is to consult and engage freight forwarding organisations. They can be awful organisations sometimes, but actually these are people that know this world inside out. And you might find that having a freight forwarder that you work with is a good investment for you in the future. And there's the point around data again. Engaging your suppliers specifically on that point. You might have come across terms of, are you a data processor? Are you all these challenges that came through with GDPR. Those challenges are going to get thrown into, again, starker relief with Brexit. So those are a few of the sort of level things. Right. This now, if we move to that point around building a base from which to react. So this is the sort of framework we've used. Again, very comprehensive, but this is the sort of framework we've used to say how, from a procurement perspective, can you make sure you're ready? So we've looked at it through these three lenses. So your contracts or your requirements, your suppliers and markets, and then category strategies. I'll come on to what that actually means in a second. But getting visibility of these, getting an understanding of where you sit with your different contracts and suppliers, and understanding how much different factors need to change your strategy. One, it's a good thing it's a good thing just because it's a good thing. This is good procurement. But two, it means that you are very much on that solid base to react to whatever challenges come through. So what sort of things would you look for in your contracts? Before we dive in, you don't have to do this across everything, right? There's common sense to be applied as to whether you do this with some contracts, all of them, a few of them do some of these things, but this is the framework. So, contracts. Firstly, have we got the basics right? We come across lots of organisations, lots of clients, even quite big companies that haven't got a register of all their contracts and they don't know when they end. That they haven't got an understanding of what currency all of those contracts are in. They're just getting invoices on a regular basis. So getting that clarity can work. So are we exposed to currency? What happens if a supplier wants a cost increase? Are they allowed to ask for one? Is there an inflation-related clause in there? What certainty have we actually got? Do we know? How easy is it for me to move suppliers? Seems basic, but one of the biggest things we've seen, particularly continental European clients doing with where they have a British supply chain, is they're engaging resilience. They're engaging a local supplier that can do the same thing. And that's partly because you want resilience in the supply chain so that you don't end up failing to be able to meet your requirements, but it's also because you've then got the capability you've then got some more leverage. Right? This is about managing cost challenges as well as about managing deliverability. When we move to suppliers, so do we understand the supply markets that we're buying from? Do we understand what are the cost drivers for your suppliers? Where do you sit with your suppliers in terms of are you a vital customer to them, or are you going to be a ripple in the ocean when they come to dealing with their own problems? Go really extreme, are they going to stay in the market that we're looking at? So some of this comes down to securing supply, but it's also about the negotiation position that we're in and the relative strength that we've got with us versus our supply chain, to see where and how cost increases, if they come through, are going to manifest themselves. And finally, that then plays into the what we call category strategies. So if we recap, category is it's an area of spend. It's typically a market that you're buying from. But we all put in loads of effort, loads of thinking into setting up our supply chain, into going, I'm going to go to that sort of supplier for this. I'm going to buy here. In fact, here I'm going to buy the raw materials. I'm going to do the assembly myself, or whatever that might be. But worth just playing through in your heads. How much would that what would need to change my strategy? So if we look at the example earlier on facilities management, it doesn't, we've had 10 years of relatively flat wage growth. So lots of category strategies are probably based on quite labour-intensive ways of doing things. What actually tips you over into wanting to invest in that extra piece of machinery? So all of those things are worth playing through in your head, and that's good business. It's probably the kind of things you're doing anyway. But actually, if you've played that through in your head, that means you can react a month faster, 6 months faster than you would otherwise. That can be the difference between staying alive and going under, or the difference between stealing a march on your competitors and not. Which takes me on to a bit more of the sort of the procurement side of things. Now, this is maybe a bit more looking at the procurement function as an entity or in the procurement profession. But this is our view, my view on what procurement will need to do differently in the future. So we say Brexit is an example of one of the forces for change that we currently have in the world. I think lots of them are going to push the procurement function down more of this sort of model. And maybe one of the failings of what we do, what procurement does in the past, is that the instinct is always to lock things down, to contract hard for things, to get certainty. That might in the future come with a bigger risk premium. Suppliers might not say yes to that. And even if they do, they might not then be able to deliver. So our view is that we're going to need to find a way to become more nimble. We're going to need to be able to react faster to changes in the market. We need to, which means as simple as being able to engage a supplier, get them onto a contract, and negotiate a good deal with them, doing that in 3 weeks, not 3 months, and that should be achievable. Alongside that, the procurement function needs to be, I've put here, could be more commercial and more integrated. Probably not a challenge in very small businesses, but you can quite quickly get to the point where procurement is looking at cost only, and we've got a sales and marketing function looking the other way, looking at revenue. And yet we've got all sorts of changes going on in the markets from which we're buying, in the markets that we're selling to, and if we're not careful, if we've got costs going up, how do we pass? If we can't pass those on, we're clearly in trouble. So procurement needs to not be focused entirely on the cost side. We need to have more of that pass through, more of that engagement with the business as a whole, and maybe focusing our efforts in terms of cost reduction on the areas that we need to protect margin, which is what that says. So practically, what does that mean? Now, there's a lot of stuff up there, right? But this is what we've started talking about in terms of what can you practically do from a procurement perspective to be faster, to be more nimble, and to be more responsive. So what this arrow that goes back on itself shows is the end-to-end procurement process. Right? So from realising you've got a requirement, through coming up with a strategy as to how you're going to get it, through potentially issuing a tender or issuing an RFQ or ringing up a supplier and asking for quotes, through to negotiating that deal, to whatever level of granularity and detail you want to go to, and down into awarding a contract, placing an order, and then managing the supplier. So there are certain bits throughout this process where we see you can add value. You can add a lot more value, and you can move faster. And these are some of these call-out bits around the side. So too often we see organisations struggling to redeploy knowledge that they've got in the past. You maybe do a contract for 3 years, forget about it. 3 years' time, what do I do? I'm like, if I can at least be starting from where I was with that knowledge, with that understanding of that market, then I'm in a better position to drive maximum value from that exercise. Similarly, if I don't need to, yes, and this is again very relevant for smaller organisations, if I can just look up what is a best practice contract in that in that particular sector. What sort of cost breakdown should I be asking for? If you can just look that up, you can quickly deploy that and move on, and you're getting a lot more value out of a lot less time. There are parts of the process that you can automate. So if you're looking at how you engage with suppliers, it's possible to automate. There are technology solutions out there, and so that you can use to automate the process of looking for quotes. So if, given that we're in a world of uncertainty, we want to go to market every year, not every 3 years, right, you can't treble your workload. So you can now look at automating the different parts of the process to quickly get those quotes in and get them processed and get onto contract with new suppliers. So the procurement organisation of the future needs to be faster. Needs to be more nimble, but needs to deliver the same or more value than it is now. These are the points that we see you can do. So, summing up, and I think I've run about to time. Okay. So, summing up, Brexit and the wider uncertain environment, bring big challenges for procurement and for supply chains, and that's both from a short-term piece, but also from the longer term in terms of how do we move strategically as an organisation. We've dealt with all of those things before, so there is great knowledge out there, there's capability out there that can deal with all of these problems, but actually piling them all on together means you've got the challenges of prioritisation and so on. Core procurement competence, skill sets, we think this is actually for our profession, this is a great opportunity and great chance to shine in terms of helping more organisations in terms of how they do manage their supply chains, how they do react. But the function can't stay static, and the approach to markets can't stay static. We're going to need to be, as I've been through, more nimble, faster, deliver more value. Technology is going to be a key part of that in terms of dealing with that age of uncertainty. So that's most of what I wanted to say. Bit of a whiz through in terms of both some of the nitty-gritty bits, but also wider, more strategic pieces. So thank you, and my contact details will be in the pack if anyone wants to get in touch.
Let's open it up for questions. Thanks, Dan, first of all.
Yeah.
Round of applause. Anyone got a specific question for Dan?
Nicola from Pyramid. You mentioned regulations. ISO is really important to us as a company. Do you foresee any changes to ISO, or it's very difficult to know?
So probably not, being the answer, because it's wider than just a European thing. But what's probably fair to say is that some of the wider regulatory landscape that things like ISO lock into might change. So what it might be, where something like that, the ISO accreditations may become differently important. Their importance in public procurement, for instance. So whilst the qualification and the standards themselves are probably in that case unlikely to change, they'll be locking into a different wider landscape, and therefore may be seen with different levels of importance or different levels of, so unlikely to change in themselves, but you never know entirely.
Great, okay, thanks very much, Dan.
Thank you.